Hello and welcome to another in our series where we're looking at Easter as regards what John's Gospel says about it. And we're coming to the end now. We've got one more to do after this, so well done for staying with us so far. You know, when Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me and take up his cross and follow me, we cannot begin to imagine the horror that would have struck into his hearers. For as we have said, crucifixion was an unimaginable execution reserved only for the lowest possible criminal. The man on the cross was left to die in unspeakable agony, for not just hours, but sometimes days on end. It's estimated that the man on the cross would probably last for about 36 hours, and so great was the suffering that we get our word excruciating from the word crucifixion. And we've become so used to the sight of the cross, with people hanging them round their necks for decoration, that we've forgotten it was this dreadful manner of execution. In recent years, Mel Gibson's movie The Passion of the Christ has brought home to us just how awful it was. This is a sort of movie you can only watch between your fingers or behind the sofa. One critic described this as a 2-hour horror movie, and that's indeed what the crucifixion of Jesus was. It was truly a horror show of human brutality visited on the innocent Son of God. Because to redeem us from sin, Jesus had to let sin do its worst upon him. So let's take up John's narrative from John 19:18. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, and carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. And there they crucified him with 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a note prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic and Latin and Greek. And the chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." But Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. "Let's not tear it," they said one to another. "Let's throw dice to see who'll get it." This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, "They divided my garments among them and cast lots for my garment." So this is what the soldiers did. And near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple who he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time, this disciple took her into his own home. Later, knowing everything had now been finished, and so the scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar there was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on the stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." And with that he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Well, it was the custom for the condemned man to carry his cross, or at least the crossbeam to which he'd been nailed, with the charge around his neck. The Synoptic Gospels tell us that Jesus was so exhausted that someone else, a man called Simon, had to carry the cross for him to Golgotha, the place of the skull, the place of execution, which would have been probably by the roadside. And John simply says the horrific words that they crucified him. They crucified the Son of God. The very restraint of the gospel writers points to the sheer horror of what was going on. And Pilate had this notice prepared: Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, written in 3 languages, and this was nailed above Jesus' head as the charge against him. And it really upset the Jewish leaders, which we can imagine was Pilate's intention. Pilate's words of contempt: "What I have written, I have written. This is your king, the King of the Jews, hanging from a cross, the full weight of Roman mockery to a race they despised." But ironically, this was indeed the paradoxical way of God becoming king, conquering the power of sin and evil in the world by taking the full weight of it himself on the cross. As Paul said later of Jesus, that he disarmed the powers and authorities, making a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. That's Colossians 1 verse 15. What looked like a terrible defeat was actually the greatest triumph. As Jesus had said in John 12, "Now is the time for the judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." We see the scripture fulfilled as Psalm 22:18 in the smallest detail, in the soldiers dividing Jesus' garment among them by gambling for it. We see the touching scene where Jesus provides for his own mother from the cross. She was obviously determined to see her boy through to the end, and God only knows the torment she was going through. As an old man had told her many years before, a sword will pierce your own soul too. Jesus commits her to John's care, maybe his own blood family at that time were unbelieving. We don't know what had happened, but she's committed to the John, the apostle Jesus loved, to his care. Finally, Jesus, consumed by thirst, asks for a drink and is given sour wine on a sponge held on a hyssop. And the mention of hyssop again makes us think of the blood of the Passover lamb, which was put on the doors and the lintels with hyssop on that first Passover night. It was also in the Old Testament used for ceremonial cleansing from sin, and now it was used for the ultimate Passover sacrifice that cleansed the world from sin. And when Jesus had taken the drink, he uttered the words, "It is finished." The Greek word is tetelestai. It means all is finished, paid in full, accomplished. The types, promises, and prophecies were finished. The sacrifices and ceremonies of the priesthood were finished. The perfect obedience was finished. The satisfaction of God's justice was finished. The power of Satan, sin, and death were finished. Christ is the goal of the law for all who believed. Everything that could be done for the salvation of sinners is accomplished. All that is left for us to do is to accept the work of Jesus by faith. Jesus, it says, then gave up his spirit. He says, "I lay down my life that I might take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down. I have power to take it up again." And John then goes to point out another remarkable fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Because of next day was the Sabbath, and a special Sabbath, the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses. As Charles Spurgeon says, their consciences were not wounded by the murder of Jesus, but they were greatly moved by the fear of ceremonial pollution. Religious scruples may live in a dead conscience. Now, we know that to hasten death by crucifixion, the Romans broke the legs of the crucified man. sort of what the Romans considered mercy killing. Just how much extra pain this inflicted cannot be imagined. But when they came to Jesus, they found he was already dead. But just to make sure, a soldier stuck a spear into his side, and what looked like blood and water flowed out, indicating modern science would indicate that Jesus most likely died of a ruptured heart. John testifies as an eyewitness, stating at the cross that these things happened, and he adds, "For these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled." In Exodus 12:46, not one of his bones shall be broken. And the scripture of Zechariah 12 verse 10 and 13 verse 6, they shall look on him who they have pierced. And one final fulfillment of scripture took place on that particular Friday, when the rich disciple Joseph of Arimathea came forward and begged the body of Jesus. And he and Nicodemus, who had been another secret disciple, quickly embalmed it with spices and then placed it in a new tomb, which apparently was for Joseph's own use. Joseph and Nicodemus, have had a bad press over the years for being secret disciples, but let's remember, they are the ones who came good when everybody else had run away. Nicodemus's offering of spices was a particularly lavish one. Fit for a king, he must have poured all this over the body of Jesus. And because of Nicodemus and Joseph, the prophecy of Isaiah 53 verse 9 was fulfilled. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. You see, John says, in the place he was crucified, there was a garden. We can see that John felt that there was an inward harmony between the garden and the cross. The fall of the first Adam took place in a garden, and it was in a garden that the second Adam redeemed mankind from the consequences of Adam's transgression. And having completed the work of redemption, having changed mankind forever, God incarnate rested on the Sabbath to awaken the first day of a new week and a new age. But for that we'll need another session.